Most economists believe that the post-COVID inflation was caused by expansionary monetary policies, supply chain disruptions, and rising energy prices. While these factors contributed to the increasing of consumer price indices, their effects were not critical. Regarding monetary policy, it is instructive to mention three rules of thumb. First, monetary policy itself cannot directly create inflation. Typically, expansionary monetary policies trigger production and the use of excess capacities, and eventually, the additional sum of money in the system boosts up asset prices and not consumer prices. Second, when fiscal policies are expansionary, monetary policies have less room to maneuver. If they do not follow the expansionary nature of the corresponding fiscal policies, they become restrictive and non-cooperative. If they follow, they can easily overstimulate the economy. Third, after inflation hit, monetary policy can have one tool to combat inflation: the reduction of macroeconomic demand by pulling up interest rates. This destructive effect needs 1.5 years on average. This delay is caused by the nature of monetary channels. Households reduce their spending on consumer goods when their mortgage obligations are rising. However, mortgage interest rates are typically fixed for 1 or 2 years terms. Therefore, the reduction of disposable income appears after this 1.5 years delay. Regarding supply chain disruptions, it is relevant to admit that in China, the lockdown measures were in effect for extended period. The country's ports were guarded so heavily by safety measures that the procedures made shipping much longer. Besides, anyone who intended to travel into China had to prove that they were not infected for 6 months. This had a cost-push effect on inflation. It increased the time of supply and the insurance costs too. Furthermore, the various countries introduced lockdown measures in different times, and this created large uncertainties. On the cost side, it was not possible to assess the consequences of supply chain disruptions owing to the unpredictable introductions of lockdowns, and neither to price in the extent of the cost increases. The third element, rising energy prices, were significant too. However, they were not tied directly to the pandemic. Since the middle of 2021, financial analysts noticed that Russia was manipulating the futures markets, especially regarding natural gas. This manipulation coincided with the rising tensions in Ukraine that eventually led to Russia invading the country. It was not possible to see the effects of this geopolitical uncertainty on inflation either. When we analyze the causes of the post-COVID inflation, it could have been possible to notice that lockdowns would affect the labor market. However, economists, due to specific historic reasons, got blindsided in this regard. This is not to say that I knew inflation was coming. I committed the same mistake too. Later in this clip I will show you what I presented to a government official in New Zealand, and even though I was close in pointing out the risks, I didn't point towards inflation. Now let's dive in and see what was possible to see at the beginning of the pandemic and why it is fair to say that inflation was inevitable. There are various approaches to define the types of inflation. One simplified version of these classifications is whether inflation is demand-pulled or cost-pushed. The appearance of inflation during 2021 was caused by both forces, demand and costs. Earlier, we mentioned the causes of increasing costs, energy prices and supply chain disruptions. Nevertheless, the component that created an inevitable tension between demand and supply was something else. At the onset of the pandemic, it was easy to identify that lockdowns would affect both the supply side and the demand side of the economy. Demand was about to decrease because people were expected to change their behavior. They were expected to try to save their resources and spend only on essential goods and services. Macroeconomic supply was about to decrease simply because people were not allowed to go to work as before. Because governments implemented the restrictions, they had to provide various forms of financial assistance to people who were stranded and could not work. these financial assistance programs were supporting exactly those actors' demand capacities who were not able to participate in the macroeconomic production to create the supply. The financial assistance programs, for example wage subsidies, were necessary and they constituted the core of fiscal stimulus packages. Central banks should cooperate with governments and they had to fund these programs. Without essential fiscal and monetary support, economies would have had to endure much larger economic depressions. During the 10 years before the pandemic, the world did not see relevant inflation, even though monetary policies were loose. Therefore, economists might have believed that inflation was no longer a problem for societies. During the first months of the pandemic, inflation did not appear immediately. Retailers still had necessary inventories available. The cost pressure on price levels were about to affect the next year's production, so inventories were becoming more and more expensive only after half a year. During lockdowns, fast food chains typically stopped their operation. Grocery stores were quick to respond and they started serving warm lunchboxes. At the time, during the first and second quarter of 2020, in the fast food serving segment, it was already possible to experience price gouging, namely, supermarkets attempted to increase prices given their increased market power. Yet, because people were at home, they could cook their meals. Typically, this segment of the economy was not significant, hence, inflation did not increase. Relevant inflation showed up in the first half of 2021. By that time, production costs and supply chain disruptions affected prices. Meanwhile, people were still receiving financial assistance when they were not allowed to go to work. And when lockdown restrictions were lifted, an additional pent-up demand appeared. People felt that they could start spending on goods and services that are beyond the essential needs. Although it should be clear that an inherent tension appeared between demand and supply, it is necessary to describe why economists were wrong when they believed inflation was unlikely to reappear. The simple answer to this question is that economists overlooked the specific circumstances of the 2010s. Most importantly, they did not identify the liquidity trap that characterized this period in most developed countries. Liquidity trap is the phenomenon when the decrease of the interest rates cannot trigger growing investments because entrepreneurs do not see any profitable opportunities. This was the case during the Great Depression between 1929 and 1933. The pivotal economist John Maynard Keynes noticed that in such circumstances it is governments that should create their purchases, so these would create the necessary demand, including investment opportunities in the economies. Keynes could rely on underutilized capacities, mainly unemployed workers, who could create value in employment. During the 2010s, a very similar situation was present in developed economies. Interest rates were unusually low. In the United States, the main interest rate was between 0% and 0.25% between 2010 and 2015. Then it increased to 1.75% to 2% by the end of 2018. After the beginning of 2019, however, the US interest rate was decreasing again. Owing to this phenomenon that despite historically low interest rates, inflation did not increase, central banks started to believe that the traditional and empirically proved trade-off between unemployment and inflation, the Phillips curve, ceased to exist. Importantly, however, it is crucial to say that in the 2010s, special circumstances caused this, and the increased money supply caused asset price bubbles only, as the mushrooming of cryptocurrencies and the high real estate prices showed. The unique phenomenon behind these circumstances was the detachment of underemployment, the proportion of people who were employed but wanted to work more hours, and the unemployment statistics. Before the global financial crisis in 2008, underemployment and unemployment moved together. However, during the 2010s, when investments in working capital finally grew, underemployment decreased quicker than unemployment. This meant firms offered more hours to those already in employment first, and they recruited new workers only later. Owing to this opportunity to employ already hired workers in more hours, the most important feature of the flexible labor markets, central bankers believed that inflation would never return. This misbelief relied on the crucial assumption that workers were easily available. Once the lockdowns hit, this underlying assumption was not true anymore. Workers were simply blocked from entering the labor market. Not noticing this problem was indeed the mistake of the central banks. They should have known that the lockdown measures were tough limits to exploring underutilized capacities in the economy. As I mentioned before, I was not an exception. I couldn't point out the risks of coming inflation. Now, I'd like to show you what I presented to a government official in New Zealand. And this is the relation of the nominal GDP growth and the growth of the minimum wage. Now, you may ask why I use the nominal GDP. It is simple. The nominal GDP is a figure that includes the effects of inflation and the growth of actual output. And this is why I compare it to the minimum wage, which is a nominal figure as well. Before 2017, the minimum wage was following the growth of the nominal GDP. However, in 2017, something changed. The government. In 2017, during the campaign, the Labour Party promised that once in government, they would significantly increase the minimum wage during 5 years. And in 2020, they kept their promise, and the increase was from $17.70 to $18.90. And in 2021, the minimum wage continued to grow to $20 per hour. One of the opposition party leaders said that that was economic suicide. He was almost right. Even though I pointed out that this quick growth of the minimum wage was risky, I didn't expect firms could protect their profits by increasing prices, therefore creating inflation. And I was wrong. I expected firms to go bankrupt, that's simple. And that was the risk of rising unemployment. Instead, we had inflation. The inflation after the pandemic is a tough lesson for economists and politicians. We need to consider all elements of the traditional economic models and the specific circumstances to assess possible consequences of economic measures. The overconfidence by which the liquidity trap was overlooked and the Phillips curve was believed to be invalid should not characterize us anymore.